Everybody, this is James Kleimann, the managing editor at HousingWire, and we've got a special episode of HousingWire Daily for you. We've got a special guest, and Timothy, welcome to the podcast. I want to give you a bit of an introduction because this is, as I mentioned, kind of an unusual episode. So Timothy Toye is the managing broker and owner of Timothy Toye and Associates in Lake County, California. And he's also a top producing agent in Lake County, California. And Timothy, we are talking today partly because of your accent. You want to share a little bit why we're talking?
Well, we all have accents, by the way. So I'm from down under. I'm actually a New Zealander, or we call ourselves a Kiwi, but I have experience both in the Australian and the New Zealand market, and they're like sister countries. So the markets are very, very similar. They're not identical, but they're similar, and both very basically have significant differences with the way real estate is done in the US.
So let's get into that. So I was in the courtroom in Kansas City, Missouri for the Sitzer Burnett case, obviously the landmark case, and a full day of testimony was centered around this idea that consumers in the US are paying way more than they should in real estate commissions to agents. And a comparable market to the US is the Australian market. And Timothy, you've done a lot of business both in California, in the US, but also in New Zealand and Australia. And so I wanted to talk to you about really whether you agree with that statement or you disagree. So, what do you think? Is the US a comparable real estate market for residential real estate sales?
There's a lot of differences. I'd start off by saying, in terms of commission rates, I'd rather be selling down under than in the US. Their rates are lower, no question, but in terms of the volume of work and putting a transaction together in the US, it's not worth the extra commission that we typically get. So I'm saying typical here because rates are all over the map, but generally speaking, rates are higher in the US, but they're higher for a reason, because there's a lot more work.
So let's get into that. So if I'm a consumer in Australia, let's say I'm on the buy side, I am buying a house in Melbourne with, let's say 4 bedrooms, 3 baths. It's probably going to be priced around $800,000 or so, give or take. It's a pretty expensive market. What is the process? Do I find a real estate agent? How do I find a home? What does that look like? Start it off for me.
Well, probably the first thing to know is you're not going to be represented as a client like you are in the US. You're a customer. So that's a fundamental difference in that the commission is paid by the seller. They call them the vendor. So I'll stick with seller because we all know that. So the seller pays the commission like they typically have been doing in the US, though not always, and they hire the listing agent. The listing agent is their fiduciary or represents the seller. Now, it's you can only you can only see a property if the listing agent lets you. So there's not an MLS like it is in the US. So you can find everything for sale online through the they do have all the properties online like they do here, but they're uploaded directly from the companies rather than going through the MLS system. As far as I know, I don't specifically have experience in Melbourne, which is in the Victoria state, but so I'm speaking from my experience. So first of all, you may not be able to work with anybody else other than the listing agent. And the listing agent is not representing you. You're a customer, not a client. It's a fundamental difference. And we can get into why that is. But I think if you've done real estate here, you can imagine the difference.
So if I'm on the buy side, I probably look on realestate.au, which is owned by Move, a Rupert Murdoch company. and I find a listing, and then maybe the agent who has the listing is going to let me check it out. Do I go to an open house? What does that look like on the buy side, even though I have no agent representing my interests specifically?
Right. So you may be working with an agent. The agent's going to need to get permission from the listing agent to show that property, and that's up to them to whether they give you. I mean, I bought a house in New Zealand just last year, and I was working with an agent who was showing me houses, and I saw one online that I wanted to see, and he said, sorry, I already checked that out. The listing agent won't let me show that property. So I had to break the relationship with him and go and work with the listing agent. And I ended up buying that house. But in the negotiation process, it was completely clear that the listing agent was not representing me. She was representing the seller. And they even give me paperwork telling me that. So I was unrepresented. How good is that from a buyer point of view?
Lucky for you, you know a lot about real estate, but the average consumer, I imagine, is probably surprised that inspection reports or doesn't know what to look for. Well, what do they do in situations where there is a problem or they just don't know how to negotiate, certain terms of a deal? What sort of recourse do they have? What sort of support do they have?
You're on your own. I mean, here's the saying, puts it rather bluntly. When I was selling, we would say, our job is to tell the buyers the good news. It's up to them to find out the bad news on their own. So, I mean, I had never actually seen an inspection report on any property until I came to the US and started doing real estate here in 1994. I'd never seen a seller disclosure until I'd come to the US and started selling real estate here. So there is a rudimentary disclosure process. It's not as fully elaborated as it is, at least here in California. I mean, the file at the end of a closing is inches thick. The poor old trees, there's so much paperwork, and where does that all come from? Well, part of it is the litigious environment that we experience in the US. You don't really have that down under. It's we're already coming up with massive differences. So it's bizarre to use it as a comparison without making significant adjustments.
Well, let's get to one of the heart of the case in Kansas City, which is this idea of cooperative compensation. So let's say that you on the buy side do have an agent who ends up, taking you via permission from the listing agent,
Right.
and they do provide you some resource.
That's better.
Does the selling agent provide compensation to this buy side agent?
So
Buy side
typically,
agent,
so it's not through an MLS system. It's done on a one-on-one basis. So, I mean, if I was able to get that, my buyer's agent might expect to get maybe 40% of the commission. And typically the commission is lower. So just getting into the commission rates down there. So you can go online and search what are commission rates in Australia, different states, different cities, New Zealand for that matter too. So it's probably going to be more like 3 to 4%. And also it's common as you get up in value that the commission rate will be stepped down. So companies will often have a policy starting at like 3 or 4. And then once you get over $1 million, it'll be more like 2 and that kind of stuff. But if you go down under, open up a magazine, newspaper, try and find out what properties are worth, you're not going to see asking prices, except on a small proportion of them. Why? We sell by auction down there. Great way to sell, by the way, but it's not something that has been adopted, generally speaking, here. I mean, we sell properties by auction here, but they're unusual. So now, when we used to list auctions down there, I'm not sure how they do it now, but we used to ask for 1% as a marketing fee upfront, write us a check, give us a credit card before we even listed the property. So that would be in addition to the commission. So there's marketing fees, there's photography fees, which we don't charge in the US. You have the fee, and maybe you charge a bit more commission depending on the extent of the marketing you do. But we don't, at least I don't ask the seller at the listing appointment to write me a check. So that's another difference that needs to be adjusted if you're going to make an asset comparison. Now, there's also GST, goods and services tax, across the board. It's like a sales tax, but it's on everything, including real estate commissions. Australia, 10%. It's a federal fee. New Zealand is 15%. So you pay the commission, but then you have to pay 10 or 15% on top of that. So that's another difference that it has to be taken into account. So it's not apples and apples. No way. And hopefully that was addressed in the trial, because it certainly it shouldn't happen without it being addressed, even to the extent you can't really compare them.
Yeah, it was a little bit in the trial. The defendants, as you may remember, mostly brokerages, right? So Keller Williams and a couple other brokerage defendants, and the NAR did say, hey, look, if you really want to do an apples to apples comparison from another country, you really want to look at Canada, right? It's the only other country that has an MLS system like we have. It's the only one that really has realtors too, right?
Yeah.
And then you also have to consider just the way that they transact, the way that they do business, very, very similar to the US. The other country that they mentioned, I can't recall exactly the person, but they said is South Africa. But if you try to look at, Australia, you try to look at Germany, some of the other, Japan, some of the others, I mean, it's night and day. It's not a more fair system
Right.
necessarily, but it's certainly one that offers a much more favorable environment for the seller rather than the buyer.
Yeah.
Canada and the US are really the two nations that have, I think, in many respects, an equal playing field
Right.
on the sell side and the buy
Yeah.
side. And that's because you have, a system of representation, right?
Yeah. So,
So
buyer
let's
representation was something that, in terms of being a fiduciary for the buyer, that was something I got introduced to coming here, and it was a little bewildering to begin with, but it makes total sense. If you're buying a property, that's a big decision, and you need to feel like your agent is in your corner. And if you're talking to only the listing agent who is only representing the seller and doesn't have a fiduciary relationship to you, it made me uncomfortable when I did it last year. And so I think that's a mature development of the real estate industry in the US, and that is good. It's positive, and that should not be undermined or threatened. Really shouldn't be.
There is dual agency that is permitted in a number of states. I don't believe it is permitted where you are in California.
Yeah, we do it. We do it.
But that is something that we do.
Yeah.
You do.
Yeah.
It is something that the analysts believe will probably accelerate if the Sitzer-Burnett verdict does effectively end the system of cooperative compensation as we know it. Have you worked with agents who do dual agency? Did you have, generally thoughts on?
Yeah, we do dual agency a lot. We're in a relatively rural area. Okay. And so let's talk about that, because I think this is a issue that should be addressed at the trial. I don't know if it is or not, but like, for example, I have a client of mine who's very invested in the area up here, sold him a lot of property, and he's a real estate attorney from a city about an hour away. He said to me, I cannot, as a experienced real estate attorney, understand the concept of dual agency. And I didn't really try and explain it to him. After all, he's the attorney. But I think this is a really key issue relative to this lawsuit, because you basically have the legal industry entering into the real estate industry. down under there are not they're not title companies. You have attorneys, they call them solicitors, who actually do the transactions. So that's another difference, by the way. So, and I'm working here. I'm happy not to have attorneys involved in real estate. I much rather deal with title companies because they tend to have a particular take on how real estate is done. And it's fundamentally different, in my view, from how real estate is done. Real estate is a cooperative exercise, and it's about two parties, consenting adults, you could say, coming together and making an agreement that they're both comfortable with. Doesn't mean they get their own way all the time. They don't, but they have to be comfortable with it. Essentially, it's about cooperation. My experience, having done real estate 40 years, is maybe 5 or 10% competition. The rest is cooperation. Now, the legal industry, on the other hand, is all about conflict and separation. Doesn't mean they don't come to agreements, but they come to them with the threat of, if you settle, then I won't sue you. I'll withdraw my suit or whatever. And so I think this is important to be understood and emphasized if the appeal goes forward to this particular case. And that's what NAR understands. And I would suggest the legal industry, as a general rule, does not. And so that has to be emphasized. The whole thing about the clear cooperation rule was to foster cooperation because that's good for the consumer, both buyers and sellers. It's about bringing people together. So I think that needs to be understood because NAR champions it. The idea of the clear cooperation policy was to make sure maximum inventory was put out there in a cooperative way so consumers were empowered. So that if that's not understood, so, and I suspect it was not, at least by the jury, then NAR's case and the other defendants are going to be in a weakened position.
When one does go to New Zealand or Australia and they work with the real estate agents, is there sort of an implied, practice of cooperative compensation, even if it isn't written in the bylaws of a trade group? I mean, is there still sort of a human recognition that I get paid when a deal gets done,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
so do you? So
yeah.
let's figure it out. I mean, does it need to be codified?
Yeah, well, I think it's inherent. It's inherent to the real estate industry. If I run into realtors who say, "Look, I'm just protecting my client." I'm like, "Protecting your client? Why? Are they under 18? They're supposed to be 18 to be able to buy a property." So it's sort of inherent, and I think you'll find the top producers naturally work well with other people, and they bring that cooperative disposition to it. Doesn't mean it happens like all that way. Sometimes you have to slug it out, but that should be a default rather than a leading intention. And I would say that much is true in Australia, New Zealand, and as well as the US. It's just there's a lot of other, the rules, the groundwork, the whole buyer representation, a lot of other stuff that make it different. There's a lot of differences.
I think one of the more interesting points to this comparison between Australia and New Zealand real estate, residential real estate, and that of the US is this idea that in the US, every consumer is paying 6%, and this is what they're getting. And if you take a look at Australia, which has a functioning real estate market, the consumer is only paying 2%. But my understanding, and obviously please correct me if I'm wrong here, is that much of that work is not handled by the real estate agents. It's handled by attorneys and other professional
Yeah, right.
services. And that when you add all of those services up, you're probably paying what you would on a commission, in most cases in the US. And am I off base
That's
there? Am
definitely
I
true.
at
It's
least
definitely
close?
true. Yeah, we
Okay.
effectively do. Well, we wouldn't call it legal work, but we do as realtors in the US do a lot of the work that solicitors or attorneys in Australia and New Zealand are doing for the client. So, but there's less of it altogether. And transaction coordinators, uh, we can't operate without transaction coordinators. It's just too much paperwork. And so that's another expense, by the way, that comes off the so-called 6%, which in our area, there aren't many people getting 6%. So out of that, you're paying your marketing fees, and you're paying your transaction coordinator, plus you're doing the marketing, photography. And by the way, are they talking about what what the lead generation Zillow and Realtor.com are charging? Did that come up in the trial?
It did come up in the trial insofar as the the attorney for the plaintiffs, Michael Ketchmark, said you're effectively having these real estate agents that are getting all these leads from Zillow or OpCity or wherever, and they're basically passing on the cost of these fees onto the selling agent because they're paying out these commissions, even if they're working with a buy side agent who,
Yeah.
doesn't know what they're doing, and all of these costs are basically just being funneled over to the consumer, and that's
Yeah.
one of the reasons that they have, in his view, artificially stabilized or inflated the commissions because no other industry, stockbrokers for example, have seen their commissions remain as remarkably stable as that of real estate agents, and that in and of itself almost suggests that there is a conspiracy.
Wasn't
And I'm
Zillow,
curious your take
wasn't
on this,
Zillow
like.
on the stand? the Yeah, OpCity.
Well, they did.
Yeah,
Yeah,
personally.
yeah. I mean, there are
Yeah,
definitely cases out there in which Zillow's practices are under question. There was the Rex case. I don't know if you followed that one. Zillow's prevailed in that one, but effectively, the idea is that all of the brokerages and the NER through this cooperative compensation rule are saying the standard here is, let's say, 5.5%, where you are. I don't know what exactly it looks like in Lake County. Maybe it's lower, maybe it's 5, but that over the last 20 years, it's pretty much always been 5, right? And that the realtors enforce this. They self-police, that they have worked in concert with the NAR and the brokerages, the broker owners, right? They're incentivized to maintain the commissions because they get a higher volume if their producers are getting paid 5% every go, right? Or 5.5 or 6 or whatever. And that effectively that is tantamount to a conspiracy. My interpretation is quite a bit different. While I was in the courtroom, I see individual agents that are negotiating because they themselves want to make more money and feel that they're providing full service. And if they are over, let's say they're at 6.5%, right? And everyone else in the county is at 5.5, you're not going to do business for very long if you're charging a full, 100 basis points higher than everyone else, right? So maybe you'll make one deal, but everyone's going to find out. You're going to get dropped down. And it's not because their managing broker told them, hey, do it at 6.5%, or the NAR told them, hey, we want you to keep paying your membership every year. So get as much as you can in commissions. I think that everyone individually in real estate is incentivized to fight for their value, but it doesn't mean that they've all gotten together and said, hey, guys, like, shh,
I know.
Timothy's
This
going
is
to get,
what's yeah
5.5%.
yeah. This is what's astounding about the settlement. I mean, I just have my own experience, but having done real estate here for 30 years, I've never seen a single instant, not one. And I'm talking hundreds, thousands of transactions. There has not been one instance that I've ever seen uh, agents work together to set commissions. It's fundamentally, it's untrue. So that's what, and I support NAR for standing up on principles and not going weak at the knees. But and by the way, commission rates are all over the place. I mean, and we're constantly involved in negotiating commission rates. It's just a daily occurrence, and you do it when you're trying to get a listing to begin with, and then you do it when you're negotiating a sale. You're always negotiating. You're always try. I mean, we're trying to make as much money as we can. I have no apologies about that. Um, the And that's part of the attraction of being in real estate, is that you can make a lot of money. But does the average realtor make a lot of money? I think it's like, isn't like 45,000 something, where I saw that online today. That was the average
So
commission.
that would be realtors. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean that lumps in a lot of part-timers, the producers, right? The people who are doing it day in, day out. I think the average realtor is a woman in her early 60s, and she's doing, probably not even a deal a month. But again, like that is, there are probably what, 750,000 like that, who are part-timers, who maybe
Right.
do business with a friend's son, or get the odd deal here and there. The professionals that do it every day and stick with it, if you're able to survive the first couple years, it can be a really great career. I think of it as sort of the ultimate in the American dream, right? I mean, there's no more entrepreneurial career out there, and if you're good at it,
Yeah.
people trust you.
Right.
You build a network,
Yeah.
and that network, I mean, we talk to real estate agents, and they say every deal should spin off triplets. Like, you do well by
Yeah.
your clients,
That's right.
and they're going to reward you, because ultimately it's an entrepreneurial endeavor, and
Well, it's
if
been
you
great.
don't do it
Yeah.
right, you're not going to last long.
It's been
So
great. It's been great to
yeah,
me.
I don't see the
Yeah.
conspiracy.
Yeah. It's been
Yeah.
great to me, but it's,
That's good.
you have to pay the price, and the price is not low. So, and that should come across. I don't, in my area, I don't believe there's any underpaid realtors. Sorry, overpaid realtors. there's,
Okay.
there's overpaid and overworked realtors, and, not they're under, if anything, they're overworked, and generally I would say they're certainly not overpaid, and some of them are really underpaid. Some transactions I definitely feel like I underpaid. Um, but yeah, I mean, just back to so Op City. I mean, this is an issue that realtors deal with. I have a mature business. I don't need referrals. I have enough clients that just keep me going. But for somebody new, they need business, and Op City is charging 38%. So so the effective rate that a lot of these agents are making is maybe 1%. They may be getting 1% of that commission that might start out at 3, 2.5, or whatever. But first of all, if you're in a franchise, 6% gone. If you're getting a lead, and is not just ZillowRealtor.com, there's a lot of lead generation services out there, which I feel at times they are predatory, and they're taking the commission out of our pockets. But if you're desperate, and a lot of realtors are desperate, then you're just going to take what you can get. And so that's, up to 30% gone. Brokerage probably taking 25, 30%. So what do you end up being left with? Maybe 1%.
And then you have your insurance, right? Then you have your gas costs, and marketing costs. Now, that doesn't go for every property. I mean, certainly during the pandemic years, homes would go under contract in a single day. How hard did sell side real estate agents really have to work for that? Certainly on the buy side, when you have multiple offer situations, there are 75 bids that come in. I think you earn
Right.
your money if your client ends up getting the house. But on the sell side, did you really do that much work?
Right. Well,
I
those are
think
those are
there
the
was
good
certainly room for,
years. Those are the good years, and
and it balances out, right?
yeah, real estate's a wheel. It's always turning around, and if it's good now, stick around. It ain't going to stay good. If it's bad, like this year's been really tough, stick around. Next year's looking like it'll be better. But that's part of the demand that it is to be a commissioned salesperson. It's you have to have strength of character to survive this business.
Let me ask you a last question here. Do you feel that the NAR has been effective in fighting this fight against? I mean, we've only talked about one lawsuit in this conversation today, Timothy, but we've counted at least 15. There are at least 15 of them now, and that's only within a month and a half of the verdict in Sitzer Burnett. There are probably going to be dozens more in the next year. Is the NAR, one, is it even equipped to fight this? And two, what do you think are the ultimate consequences of that verdict?
they lost the case, so that's a verdict enough. But I appreciate the fact that they're appealing. I think they're getting other representation. I think the decision of like Anywhere and Remax to settle was a mercenary decision rather than a principled decision. And one thing I know about real estate is you have to justify what you charge. You have to do that. I tell that to my associates, and so NAR has to do that, and they haven't done it well enough yet. On the other hand, 8 people in 90 minutes or whatever it was, only a couple had actually worked with the realtor. How can that be? How can that be justice? But I'm afraid that there's unintended consequences that can occur as a result of this. And I think the DOJ, which I understand is looking into these lawsuits, I think they're talking with Ketchmark. They should be talking with NAR also, because
they are, but they're very different kinds of conversations.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid we're going to be going backwards, and we're actually going to destroy cooperation in the real estate industry, which benefits consumers, both sellers and buyers. And we're going to end up with more conflict, and that won't be good. So, I'd rather be selling real estate in the US than I would be down under.
Are there any other notable differences between the residential real estate market in the US and, let's say, Australia?
It's called the Code of Ethics. So the US is maybe a big bad place. If there's a racket, you can find it in the US. Down under, we're a little bit more friendly, a little more naive, perhaps. But the Code of Ethics impressed me right from the beginning, that it's an attempt to establish standards for how you actually conduct yourself in the real estate in the US. And I applaud the NAR, and that should not be lost. We have to keep the ethical standards in real estate, because there's plenty of opportunity for you not to be. And the Code of Ethics in and of itself, in my view, is not enough. You have to be an ethical person, which means, that means you have to be in right relationship to your clients. But the Code of Ethics sets a bar, and that's a really, really good thing. And the NAR has done that. They champion that, and they should be applauded, and they should be thanked for doing that. And they're getting they've been targeted a lot. Some of it's justified. I suggest most of it is not.
Timothy, thank you so much for being with me today. I've learned so much about how the residential real estate market in Australia works. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing your knowledge and your expertise. And hope you have a great holidays. And everyone will catch you on the next episode. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.